So joining us for our PFAS panel, we have Sophie Green. Sophie is the PFAS coordinator at the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. Prior to moving to the MPCA, she worked on human health risk assessment in the Office of Water at the EPA's headquarters in Washington, D.C. Sophie has a BA in chemistry from Carleton College and an MS in geology from the University of Vermont. We also have Yodit Shido, and I'm sorry if I mispronounced your last name. She's a project manager at the MPCA's site remediation program. Her background is in environmental engineering, particularly the water resources sector. Prior to joining the PCA, Yodit worked in international development and environmental consulting. We also have, okay, so he is here, Mark Ostby. I do not have your bio, so when you begin speaking, please introduce yourself. That would be very great. Thank you so much.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you, and we can hear you. That's exciting. We also have Rick Wheeler, who is a partner with Rooftop GPM. He has over 30 years of experience in advising private and public clients on the acquisition, disposition, and redevelopment of brownfield sites and associated environmental due diligence, risk assessment, and liability considerations. He is currently involved in many significant cleanup and redevelopment projects. Rick also specializes in representing clients in federal and state Superfund and environmental administrative proceedings and regularly counsels clients on environmental compliance, under and above ground storage tanks, and pollution insurance matters. Rick is a member of Minnesota Brownfields Advisory Committee and served on the MPCA's Vapor Intrusion Stakeholder Advisory Group. We also have Mark Keeper, who is a senior scientist and a professional geologist with more than 18 years of experience in the environmental field. Mr. Keeper's experience includes large-scale environmental project management, site characterization and corrective action, due diligence, brownfield redevelopment, voluntary cleanup programs, corrective action programs, and remediation, system design, implementation, and maintenance. Mr. Keeper has completed some of the largest brownfield redevelopment projects in the state of Minnesota, including Northern Stacks Development, Exhibit A, at a former Superfund site, as well as performed environmental work at hundreds of other sites throughout the United States, including several with PFAS impacts. In addition to his consulting work, Mr. Keeper has co-authored several published technical papers and has presented at various technical seminars. And so that is everybody. I'm going to hand the microphone over here to Rick.
Wait, sorry, much of the Mark, your presentation you did? You think you need to give a presentation?
We do have some virtual folks presenting slides. Are you able to share your screens?
Would you like us to pull that PowerPoint up, or is somebody going to advance the slides for us? Sorry about this.
We can go ahead and do that for you.
Yodi, do you have that easy access, or I can try to grab it?
There we go. Can you help us see our screen virtually?
Okay, this looks good. Hello, everybody. My name is Sophie Green. Sorry that my name tag on Zoom says Yodit. She kindly forwarded me her link because I was having trouble getting in today. And I didn't realize that it changed my name to her name, but I am Sophie Green. I'm the PFAS coordinator at the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. Thank you so much for allowing me to speak about PFAS and Minnesota's various PFAS initiatives for just a few minutes here. I'm sure this group in particular is probably very familiar with PFAS, but I do like to give a quick introduction. I'll just breeze through this quickly for anybody who might not be familiar with this class of compounds. So PFAS, of course, is an acronym. It stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. So this is a large family of chemicals. And what they all have in common is that they contain these chains of carbon and fluorine bonds. So the carbon-fluorine bond is incredibly stable. It does not break down under environmental conditions. So some PFAS might transform to another PFAS in the environment, but those degradate products will themselves also be PFAS. And part of, this is part of the reason why people frequently call PFAS forever chemicals. So again, this is an incredibly diverse class of compounds. Some PFAS are polymers, some are not. They have a variety of different physical and chemical properties. Some are quite soluble and mobile in groundwater. Others are vapors at room temperature. We just talked about their differences in environmental half-life, but they also have a huge variety in biological half-life. So humans, our bodies are able to eliminate some PFAS relatively readily. Other PFAS just build up in our bodies over time because we do not have the biological mechanisms to eliminate them very efficiently at all. So there's a huge number of useful traits that these substances have. This is why they were invented. They can repel oil and water at the same time. They can survive in very corrosive or high heat conditions. They're used to create low friction surfaces. They can suppress oxidation and combustion. Essentially, if you don't want something to blow up or catch on fire, it's a very useful additive, and more. So on the next slide, I'll just very briefly touch on some of the industries that we know to use PFAS. So again, the uses of PFAS are so numerous, you could never fit them on a single slide. Here is just a list of some of the PFAS applications that we tend to know a lot about. We've done a lot of work in Minnesota on banning PFAS in paper and food packaging applications. But the industries that use PFAS, again, are just incredibly numerous. There's firefighting foams, there's the metal plating industry, there's construction industry, and we're continuing to learn more and more about the specific applications in each of these fields. So on the next slide, I'll just talk a little bit about what we know about their toxicity. So again, there are thousands of PFAS compounds in the family, but we only have health assessments in Minnesota for 5 of those substances. We are very lucky to have toxicologists at our Department of Health who are able to derive their own novel toxicity assessments. And they have done so for PFOS, PFOA, PFHXS, PFBA, and PFBS. And they are soon, hopefully to release this year, a new assessment for PFHXA. But even there, you'll notice that list is a lot less than 5,000 or 6,000 or 7,000 that we know to be in the PFAS family. So the vast majority of PFAS do not have the toxicity information. So the underlying animal studies or human health epidemiological studies available for toxicologists to derive these risk assessments. For the PFAS that we do know about, there's a variety of different types of adverse health effects in humans that we see. We see evidence in some cases of immune suppression. So you might have a decreased response to a vaccine, antibody response to a vaccine if you've had exposure to PFAS. In some cases, there are developmental effects, reproductive effects, thyroid effects, liver effects. Many PFAS have effects on the liver. And finally, in the case of PFOA, we do see some strong evidence for carcinogenicity. So again, I'll just emphasize the vast majority of PFAS in the family, we do not have enough toxicity data available to derive human health benchmarks. So the next slide, when we're doing these toxicity assessments, it's of course very important to think about the routes of exposure that might be the most significant or the ways that we could be exposed. Sorry, could you go back one more slide? And so PFAS, because there's such diversity in their physical and chemical properties, it really depends which compound you're talking about when you're thinking about what would be the most significant route of exposure. So for PFAS that are very, very soluble and mobile in groundwater, we might be concerned about somebody's drinking water as a source of exposure. Other PFAS like PFOS are incredibly bioaccumulative in fish tissue. And if you happen to be eating fish that you harvested from a surface water body that had some PFOS contamination, that could be a very significant, perhaps even the most significant source of exposure for you. There are other PFAS that cause developmental effects, and they also accumulate in breast milk or in animal milk. In those cases, we're very concerned about young children and infants and their routes of exposure. Other PFAS accumulate in other types of food like vegetables, and every day now we're learning more about PFAS that might be present in the air, ambient air and indoor air. So when you're thinking about exposure routes, you really need to think about the circumstance of the contamination as well as which specific PFAS compound you're dealing with. The next slide. Again, I'll just kind of reiterate why we're concerned about this in Minnesota. We have this large family of compounds that are incredibly persistent in the environment. We know that they can cause toxic effects in humans. And we're concerned that if we continue to release these substances that don't break down into the environment over time, the likelihood that we have exposure that exceeds health-based guidance is going to increase. And that is something that we want to make sure that we're addressing now, so we don't find ourselves increasingly in this position in the future. So that brings us to Minnesota's response. Just this year in February, we published a document called Minnesota's PFAS Blueprint. It's a large document, it's over 100 pages. It's designed to try to lay out a blueprint for a holistic and systematic approach for addressing PFAS. So because these compounds are incredibly persistent, they cross media, they touch lots of different programs and regulatory agencies, we wanted to acknowledge all of these interconnections between programs and policies and regulation, and with all of that complexity in mind, propose a strategic path forward. So on the next slide, this is again a very long, complex document, but it kind of boils down to this one main idea, which is this hierarchical approach for how we want to deal with PFAS in our environment. First of all, we'd like to prevent PFAS pollution wherever that is possible. That's the most health protective and the most economical way to deal with this problem. In some cases, we can't prevent the pollution. Maybe it already happened. Maybe that PFAS is being used currently in an application that's seen as essential for society, and we don't have alternatives available right now. In those cases, we'd like to manage the PFAS pollution so that we protect human health and the environment. And of course, there are some cases that we know of where that PFAS pollution has not been prevented and has not been managed, and we're in the unfortunate circumstance where we have a contaminated site that needs to be cleaned up. But that is, of course, a very expensive and time-consuming process, and we'd like to prevent additional cleanup needs in the future by preventing and managing PFAS pollution. So the next slide, just want to draw people's attention to some of the considerations that were included in the PFAS blueprint. So one thing that came up over and over as we were developing this document was the need to have a better understanding of how much PFAS exists in the environment right now and how much is currently being released in various types of programs and from various types of facilities. So the PFAS blueprint included a lot of these short-term initiatives, so things that we intended to work on in the next 2 years that had to do with monitoring or emissions reporting. So we talked about the need for developing a plan for monitoring PFAS at active landfills. We talked about the need for coming up with a plan for monitoring PFAS at all of our MPDES permitted facilities. We talked about adding PFAS to Minnesota's air emissions inventory process and developing a plan for performance testing for PFAS at our various permitted air sources that might be PFAS users or releasers. And we talked about the need to update our guidance for recommended analyte sampling at cleanup sites so that we're considering PFAS in that process. And because there were all of these initiatives that had to do with PFAS monitoring and across all of these programs, we decided it would be very helpful for consistency to put all of that work under one umbrella, which we're calling the PFAS monitoring plan. So the PFAS monitoring plan is going to coordinate all of these different short-term initiatives to support our agency in doing source discovery and mitigation work around PFAS. The next slide. So just a little bit more about the monitoring plan. We have various programs that are participating and helping us develop this monitoring plan, including our wastewater program, our municipal and industrial wastewater programs, industrial stormwater, solid waste and hazardous waste programs, the air program, and of course the remediation program. So the goal is for all of these programs to help us answer these questions. So what types of facilities or sites will be required to monitor as we start rolling out this plan? What types of materials will we be asking folks to monitor? How and when will the monitoring be implemented? So when will we start making these requirements? How frequently will the monitoring be required? What analytical labs and analytes are available for us to monitor? And then finally, what will the agency be doing with this data as we collect it? So as we're developing these answers to these questions across all of our programs, we're working with various stakeholder groups to help us answer these questions in the best way possible. So we're giving everybody multiple chances to weigh in on the choices that we're laying out under those questions. So next slide. All right, so just a basic process and timeline here. We are working on developing these plans right now. Our plan is to release the monitoring plan document in draft form earlier this fall, so fall 2021. Then we will accept comment on these plans. We'll have conversations with various types of stakeholder groups and the general public. We will likely revise these plans, and then we will release the plans again in final form in winter of 2022. And I just want to again emphasize that the implementation of these plans is going to vary depending on which program we're talking about, but the implementation is not going to start as soon as the final plans are released in all cases. So definitely tune into the implementation piece for more information on that. All right, so next I'm going to hand it off to the real Yodit, who's going to talk to you about a little more of the details with respect to the remediation monitoring plan.
Thank you, Sophie. Well, I guess she's already introduced me. I'm Yodit Shado, and I'm with the Remediation Division, and I'm going to discuss the specifics of the monitoring plan and the guidance document, a little bit about their similarities, their differences, and the process that we're taking in developing them both. Next slide, please. So I think you're all pretty familiar with the blueprint, and that's the agency's action plan for PFAS. And I'd say that it really does a good job of answering the what and the why, you know, what PFAS is or are and why we need to monitor, sample, and identify PFAS throughout the state. And it is centered around 3 strategies: the prevent, manage, and cleanup. And our division is responsible for the 3rd strategy, the cleanup strategy. So that brings us to the monitoring plan, which is also an agency-wide document, but really tries to answer the where and the when. So, you know, how frequently, which sites, etc. So next slide, please. And before going to the monitoring plan, I'd like to share a little bit about the basis for the process that's outlined in the actual monitoring plan. It's actually drawn from a source evaluation tool that we refer to as the protocol. And the protocol is a quantitative risk assessment tool that was developed a couple of years ago. It assesses PFAS generating industries using national level business databases like the North American Industrial Classification System. And it then assesses risk to nearby receptors by cross-referencing identified locations with potential pathways of concern and known contamination sources. So we are currently validating the protocol using a 4-county pilot study. And the results of that study are going to be used to support the development of the guidance document. So next slide, please. And so although it's still in the validation stage or phase, we've been able to draw upon the protocol for certain elements of the monitoring plan. And here on the slide, there's a figure, sort of a summary figure of the process that's being used. And it's really sort of a decision-making process for whether or not we decide to sample for PFAS at a site, or we ask for PFAS sampling at a site. And the decision will really happen at the beginning of the site's entrance into the program. We look at a few quantitative and qualitative factors, such as, you know, the site's current and historic use, whether or not it aligns with any NAICS codes or North American Industrial Classification System codes, where there's known PFAS usage or generation or disposal. And then we also look at proximity to any known PFAS releases. So from that point onwards, it really resembles the MERLA process that I'm sure most of you are familiar with, where a site investigation will be carried out to determine the extent and magnitude of contamination, and then cleanup efforts are carried out during the remediation stage. And now I'm going to hand it over to Mark to discuss the requirements for the Brownfields program.
Thanks, Yodit. Hi, everyone. For folks that don't know me yet, I'm Mark Osby. I'm a hydrologist with the Voluntary Investigation and Cleanup Unit here at the MPCA. I'll just be talking for a few minutes here about some of the nuances involved with how the Brownfield program treats the PFAS compounds. My intention here is just to provide a very high-level overview and not get too far into the weeds, of course. I'll start with saying that PFAS won't be treated any differently than any of the other contaminants, such as PCE, TCE, recrometals, or any of the more common things that we see. Let's hope that PFAS does not enter that common category. When is PFAS sampling necessary for a site for the purposes of a brownfield program? That'll depend on a couple of different things. When there's a history of an industry involved that's been related to PFAS, and there's a potential risk based on current or planned land use. This could be a risk due to drinking water. Wouldn't be too common due to municipal water systems, but there may be a well present. Maybe a bigger issue on the edges of urban and rural areas, or where development is occurring very rapidly. The risk could be due to a potential soil exposure, such as a daycare with a playground or workers doing soil corrections associated with redevelopment activities. There may also be a potential for soil leaching to groundwater via stormwater infiltration. And I'll put a shameless plug here to not put infiltration devices over source areas. Happens a lot more than we would like. PFAS sampling may also be required to meet landfill disposal requirements. This may vary under the landfills and may be down to how it's classified. The other final part is there is a desire to have PFAS included in the identified release for the purposes of assurance letters. We have already issued NADs for PFAS several times over the last few years, so it is a possibility to do. Feel free to reach out at us over at Brownfields or the VIC program, either later in the meeting during the question thing or to me individually or any one of us. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to the real Yudi and let her take over, and I'll be available for questions later. Thank you, folks.
Thank you so much, Mark. And we can move on to the next slide. Great. So now that we've discussed the background and some of the content and criteria, why don't we move on to what's coming next? I'm sure the burning question is, why are there 2 documents coming out? And it's kind of a simple reason. We know that PFAS has really been prioritized during the past couple of years, and it was important to ensure an agency-wide approach to monitoring and to make sure that that approach was going to be made publicly available. However, the allotted timeline really wasn't sufficient to produce a detailed best management practices document. So we have the monitoring plan that really provides sort of a framework, guiding principles, if you will, of the sort of the path forward that we intend to take. Whereas the guidance document will include the results from the protocol or the pilot study. It will draw heavily upon the validated protocol, and it will also provide an opportunity for inputs from external stakeholders. I believe that in the past, some of the feedback that's been received from stakeholders has been that predictability and consistency were 2 important elements that were really desired from regulatory guidance. So in this way, we'll have both the predictability through the monitoring plan and the consistency through the guidance document. And I think the main similarity that should be highlighted about both documents is that they're really intended to be dynamic, in that there is going to be a sort of continuous process of updating these documents using the learnings that come about the fate and transport of PFAS, about investigative approaches, about remedial approaches as well. So think of them as dynamic documents that grow as our learnings grow. So, I mean, in summary, the monitoring plan can really be considered sort of a guidance light document. It'll provide the foundation for investigating PFAS at remediation sites. And the intention is really that someone that reads the monitoring plan, the remediation monitoring plan, will walk away with a really basic understanding of how to design an investigation into PFAS and understand the MPCA's next steps regarding the regulation of PFAS under MRLA. And the guidance document is going to provide much more detailed information like lab QA/QC, SOPs for sampling, conceptual model development. It'll also look at screening tools, and of course the results from the pilot study will also be will play a big role in the development of the guidance document. But the most important part is that the guidance document is going to be developed with your input. This is, as Sophie mentioned earlier, the implementation portion of our monitoring plan. The process is really expected to be similar to the BMPs that were developed for vapor. And again, the hope is that these two will really complement one another, providing the predictability and consistency components. Next slide, please. So this slide provides a very brief outline of the expected schedule for the documents and the stakeholder groups. So the monitoring plan, as Sophie mentioned, is going to be launched in early 2022, and we aim to launch the PFAS guidance document in 2023. So by this time, we'll have completed the pilot study and we'll be able to finalize the validation of the PFAS protocol. We'll also have draft versions of the guidance document that will be made available for review during the year 2022. And so from 2023 onwards, we'll be incorporating officially PFAS sampling requirements for incoming sites. And again, this schedule is tentative. So if we could move on to the next slide, please. So for all those who are interested, say welcome, please let us know if you are interested in joining the external stakeholder group for the development of the guidance document. So perhaps just a brief summary of what would be expected for those who do decide to serve. We would expect you to act as a representative for your stakeholder subset. So that means that we'd ask you to communicate updates from MPCA to your respective subset groups and consolidate feedback from your subset group and communicate that back to MPCA. You will also be responsible for attending meetings. So we plan on holding them quarterly, hopefully in person, but that remains to be seen. And again, you will be tasked with representing your stakeholder subset group at these meetings. And lastly, you will be responsible for providing feedback on draft documents. So for those of you that are interested in joining this stakeholder group and being a part of the process of guidance development, we ask that you email myself or Tim Grape. The emails are provided on the screen, but we can also include them in the chat. And again, next slide, we thank you for joining and feel free to ask questions.
Great, thank you. I was expecting. Thank you for that background. I know that we are behind schedule, but I also know that there are a lot of questions on us. So if it's cool with you all, and even if it's not, we are going to go over schedule a little bit just so that we can take some questions from our participants, either in person or virtually. We also have our wonderful panelists here in person who do not have presentations but can answer questions on liability, etc., or development processes. So any questions? Otherwise, I have my own little list, of course.
Yeah, my question isn't really about the PFAS, it's about keep your guidance repeated, and similar to the vapor intrusion BMPs, which are truly guidance that haven't gone through the same external vetting process. So it's a moving goal sort of thing, and I hope that at some point we could actually codify guidance that both PFAS and vapor.
So the question for those folks who are virtual was kind of broadly on guidance in general and how it seems to be a process. We're waiting on guidance, and when is that actually going to be codified or actually put into place? So I don't know if any of you have answers to that, or if anybody virtually has an answer to that, or if it was more just a comment. But I did want to make sure that everybody virtually could hear that.
Yeah, I can jump in on that. This is Tim Grape, and my name comes up as Mark. I'm piggybacking on Mark's entrance here today, but the guidance question is a great one. And the timing, I think, that Yodit laid out, what we're releasing the monitoring plan, that's kind of that precursor to guidance, right? And that's what we're currently using to evaluate sites, right? So there's some higher level guidance contained in the monitoring plan, like the where, the how, the details, right, on how to do that. And the more prescriptive part will come with the guidance itself. And again, similar to how we did the VI BMPs, those have been a process, and they're still a process, right? Where, guidance is evolving, obviously with emerging contaminants like PFAS, and even as vapor was, right, with, the new tox data and ways to evaluate VI, we will continue to evolve the guidance with VI as well as, with PFAS. We want to get the monitoring plan out. We're, obviously that's more of a cohesive program-wide effort at the agency than, the VI component was really remediation focused to start off. Others, have adopted variations of that within the agency. But the timing, again, is we're looking at the monitoring plan rolling out, and then, building off that to develop the guidance and using the kind of the same approach with the stakeholder group. And, tapping that resource of all you folks, that are dealing with it, and being transparent on how we're progressing through that, and getting the feedback and resources from you all to develop that guidance as this plays out. And again, the timing on that, realistically, how long it takes to develop guidance and get it in print and out, we're looking at that 2023 as a kind of our target to have like a full release of a guidance document to come forth. And then in the meantime, working through the monitoring plan as we evaluate sites through that process. So hopefully that helps answer some of the questions on timing around guidance and how the development will play out.
I got an eyebrow raised, so I think that's an approval. I do have a question here, kind of speaking on as we wait for guidance. How are PFAS now being addressed from a legal standpoint in real estate acquisition and redevelopment transactions?
Mark? I guess first off, I'd say, Chris from PCA, you left your fly up here. Collection, that'd be great. It's harassing Mark, even as I speak. So we're heavily engaged in dealing with PFAS in all of our transactions these days from a corporate standpoint. Whether it's an asset purchase, a real estate purchase, a stock purchase, basically all of them. And we're doing that in a variety of ways. One of them is that all of our transaction documents now are defining and including PFAS within, whether it's hazardous materials or hazardous substances, whatever the operative definition is. And we do that because all those documents have representations and warranties. And so if we're on the buyer side, we're trying to hold the seller responsible for making representations about whether there's a problem there, including PFAS. So if we haven't listed it, we can't just say hazardous substances because, well, it's not a listed hazardous substance. It's not a listed hazardous waste. And so it's just out there in kind of an amorphous sense right now until further action is taken at the federal or the state level. So we have to be very cautious about that. And it also comes up with representations and warranties policies. If any of you are familiar with those, you can buy an insurance policy that will basically cover the cost in the event that the seller breaches a representation they made. So as a quick example, let's say the seller says there's not been a release of hazardous materials defined to include PFAS at this site. Later, as you're redeveloping, it turns out there was. You may be able to look to the reps and warranties policy to cover the cost of that breach. Now, with asbestos and PCBs, there are exclusions in those policies. They're standard. They're always going to exclude those. There's not yet one for PFAS. So maybe there's a window of opportunity there, at least for a short period. And then I know we're short on time, so I'll say the second thing that we're doing is working with consultants like Mark and doing phase 1 assessments, and we are now oftentimes including PFAS as a non-scope item. And why do I say that? PFAS, again, as not a hazardous substance or a petroleum product, doesn't fall within the scope of the ASTM guidance that almost all of us here work with daily. So what we'll do is we'll concert with the consultant, figure out, look, is this likely a problem? Is it next to a 3M site where the stuff is manufactured, or DuPont, or whichever the manufacturer might be? Is it a site where there was a lot of paper recycling, where there might have been, pizza boxes and that sort of thing that use this as a compound? And if there is, then we'll look at things like, well, is there an on-site water well? Is this served by a private water supply? Because we'd be concerned about that, and we do that to phase 2. So we're basically considering PFAS to be a hazardous substance, even though it really isn't one yet. It doesn't mean we're doing anything at some sites. There's some sites where we wouldn't look at PFAS really at all in the phase 1, except at the scoping stage to figure out if it's an issue or not. So that's what we're doing right now.
Thank you, Rick. Any other questions? We will do a question back there.
I just have a question about how is being handling their liability protections that they spend on landowners and entities for redeveloping our sites when they're the PFAS, are they still giving a blanket liability exemption, or is it changing, or is it site by site? Like, how are they handling that totally now?
Yeah, so this is a question for NPCA virtual folks. If you didn't hear that, it is about extending a liability for a landowner. I can't tell what the question actually was. Liability guidance without current guidance. How does the NPCA extend? Thank you. Mark's going to back me up here. Thank you.
So getting into how is the NPCA treating PFAS in regards to the liability assurances during a redevelopment or property, similar to a NAD or etc.
I think we have Mark.
I got part of that question. It sounds to me like you're asking about the liability assurances on PFAS side. So, because under the state statute for issuing NADs, it's included in 115B as being a hazardous substance, pollutant, or contaminant. It would be included, and we can issue no association determinations for it. That's the short answer.
Maybe a longer answer here as well. No?
No, I'll just add to that, with Vic, it's all about what you request. It's all voluntary. So if you're not looking for PFAS, it's not going to be part of the identified release. It's not going to be part of the NAD. So again, to Rick's point, is there a reason to look for PFAS? And if you find it, then we could include it into an NAD. That's all.
All right, thank you. And thank you for backing me up there.